So now I'd like to introduce Sarah Fraser and Doug Kelly. Sarah Fraser is the Assistant Deputy Minister of Rural Opportunities, Tenure and Engineering Division in the Ministry of Forests, Lands and Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. Doug Kelly is Director of Forest Tenures in the same ministry and also co-chairs the Community Forest Joint Working Group. So Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Jennifer. And I want to also just thank Susan Mulkey for all her help in getting us up and running here today. I'm coming to you from the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish speaking people, the Cowichan Nation and the Malahat Nation, and I'm very happy to live and work from this location. And just thank you to the association for inviting us to speak here today. I'm really excited about that. Certainly would prefer to be there with you in person, but this is pretty good technology. So maybe in the future I'll be able to come to one of your live events. So for those that don't know me, I am fairly new to my portfolio, but I have been in the provincial government for about 30 years. And most of that time was spent in rural development on initiatives that support rural areas. And so I was certainly around as the community forests started to get up and running and the agreements were provided. And I know just how valuable community forests are to the local economies and to people in the communities in which you support. So I'm really honored to be here today because I just know the value of community forests. And I'm joined by Doug, who has been in the ministry much longer than I, and he is going to be here right through to the end. I have been called away. I will try to stay as long as I can, but Doug will be here to answer any questions at the very end. So Doug, if you could maybe share your screen and put the slides up, and we'll start the presentation. Great, thank you. And if you want to flip to the next slide. So, why do we need to modernize forest policy? People across the province are rightly passionate about how we manage our forests, but forest policy in our province has not evolved fast enough to really address the challenges facing the sector and public expectations. BC's forestry policy framework was put in place nearly 2 decades ago, and it's inadequate to address today's challenges. Timber supply is decreasing, because of wildfires, beetle salvage, and withdrawals from the timber harvesting land base. Sawmill overcapacity remains, while value-added and secondary manufacturing have not grown significantly. Modernizing mills to stay competitive has led to a pattern of job losses in rural communities. Concentrated forest tenure holdings limit the province's ability to achieve its objectives. Reconciliation is extremely important to the government, and the Declaration Act requires us to advance policy change with Indigenous peoples. This means consultation and cooperation. To remain competitive, BC forest sector will need to change, and the province is leading that change. We need to be a more diversified sector that goes beyond being more and more efficient and adds greater value to the products we produce. These changes are part of government's broader mandate, which includes support for communities, preservation of environmental values, and advancement of lasting reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Thanks, Doug. So the goals. The release of the intentions paper signals an exciting time in forest management and represents an opportunity to build a vibrant, inclusive industry for the future. In doing so, the work of the intentions paper is guided by 5 goals. Sustainability. BC has practiced sustainable forestry for decades, but as I mentioned earlier, the province's timber supply is decreasing. We've gone from 85 million cubic meters a year in 2007 to 56 million cubic meters by 2026. To enhance stewardship while addressing ecosystem health and resilience, policy changes are needed. BC will continue to be a world leader in providing sustainable forest products and forest policy that considers the ever-changing environment. There is a need to increase forestry's economic and management opportunities for Indigenous peoples. Doing so aligns with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act and advances the well-being of Indigenous communities. It also reduces uncertainty and strengthens confidence in the industry. For decades, the forest industry has provided good-paying jobs, supporting families in many BC communities. As these communities strive to become more resilient, there's an opportunity for the province to work with them to better consider their interests. Local access to timber can support diversified manufacturing focused on value rather than volume. Local communities should be engaged in discussions about wildfires, local employment, and sustainable management of the forests that surround and nurture British Columbians. Forest products are globally traded. They are desired for their lower carbon footprint, are produced sustainably in the province, and are verified by third-party forest certification organizations. BC's forestry sector must continue to be competitive on the global stage, keeping in mind those who invest in BC and provide good-paying jobs. The forests are owned by British Columbians. It's important to ensure they receive fair returns on their assets. Next slide, please, Doug. Thanks. So BC government has been asking what forest management in the future of the sector should look like since about 2017. We've talked to Indigenous governing bodies, local governments, industry, labor, interest groups, including NGOs, and the general public. And some of those conversations that we've had include the coast forest sector revitalization, the interior forest sector renewal, Forest and Range Practices Act Improvement Initiative, and the Old Growth Strategic Review. Through all of those processes, we've consistently heard there's a need to increase our ability to support public and Indigenous interests in the forest sector. Laying the foundation for change, the intentions paper is framed around three guiding principles that inform some components of a vision for forestry in BC. Increasing forest sector participation is designed to increase Indigenous and community participation and ensure BC timber sales have the allocations necessary to support market pricing and value-added manufacturing. Enhancing stewardship and sustainability to ensure public land is managed sustainably and to improve the full and responsible use of available fiber. And strengthening the social contract so that the growth of good jobs and long-term opportunities remain a priority. This also means transitioning from high volume to high value and encouraging diversification in higher value manufacturing. And equally important, ensuring all communities have an opportunity to benefit from their local forests. I'll now turn the floor over to Doug Kelly, who will touch on each of these areas.
Couldn't find my unmute. Good morning, everybody. My name is Doug Kelly. I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations out of Victoria here. I'm going to quickly go over this. There's a series of slides here. There's 20 intentions, so just prepared. I'm going to go through these, and I hope it's not too drawn out. Increasing forest sector participation is one of the key goals of the intentions paper, the modernization of forest policy. The first policy intention is about creating more opportunity to redistribute forest tenures, including enhanced legal mechanisms to allow tenure to be redistributed for harvesting, leading to the objective of greater diversity in ownership and involvement. Policy intention number 2 is establishing a clear and equitable framework for determining compensation for lost harvesting rights. Policy intention number 3 is introducing a more flexible, not proportionate approach to how licensees are reduced if a timber supply is being reduced. This is not this is from a timber taking as opposed to chief forester determination. Policy intention number 4 is further defining tenure transfer requirements to address tenure concentration and the public interest considerations when transfers or change of controls happen. So this is enhancing the current provisions that we commonly refer to as Bill 22. Policy intention number 5 is enhancing revenue oversight for log exports by adding the ability to audit and assess fee in lieu of manufacturer payments when logs are exported out of the province. I'm just trying to get my scrolling to work. And policy intention number 6 is evolving the BCTS policy on maximum timber sales restrictions. This will consider an alternate approach to allow for more sale opportunities at smaller volumes to smaller or value-added manufacturers. I've got too many. There we go. Where are you? I guess. There we go. Slide number 7. So we're there. Good. Enhancing stewardship and sustainability, one of the other key goals. This includes policy intention number 7, which is the old growth and FRPA, and there will be more discussions on this really within minutes, I hope. There's plenty to be said on both of these important initiatives, but I'll defer to my colleagues on this, which is Rachel and Margaret, respectively, and they'll be speaking to you shortly. Policy, and that's 7 and 8. Policy intention number 9, which is to work collaboratively with Indigenous partners and stakeholders to reintegrate prescribed and cultural fire and forest management, a very important issue, especially given the risks we have now with increased fire hazards throughout the province. Policy intention number 10 is looking at providing how the minister has more flexibility in allocating timber, specifically looking to improve the apportionment process so that decisions can be made in a more timely manner to improve business stability and sustainability. Policy intention number 11 is looking at modernizing the rules for tracking and administer timber harvest with a review of how cut control is designed and implemented. Policy intention number 12 is improving the accountability and tenure management by considering tools available to decision makers, ensuring strategies are employed in the public interest. Number 13, strengthen government discretion for decisions involving harvesting and road construction to ensure decisions are based on important forest values. So a change in the current process on how permits for roads and cutting permits are administered. Number 14 is to strengthen the government's ability to ensure silviculture and innovative investments are realized. As an example, we could consider limits on timber harvesting until provincial silviculture investments have achieved optimized harvesting opportunity. So protecting the investment that we already have in the forest. I'm switching over to the third goal, which is strengthening social contract. And that's starts off with policy intention. This is the last group, so I'm almost there. Policy intention number 15, to modernize forest tenure replacement requirements by revisiting the criteria and expectations. Be looking for holders of replaceable tenures to find creative ways to partner and grow industry. And I do want to point this out to this group in particular. This is a policy I would say you need to pay attention to. Number 16 is looking at improving fiber access for higher value domestic manufacturers. We will work with the value added sector reps to understand how the province can support community valued, competitive value-based businesses. This will include advancing a process to minimize the burning of slash piles or developing of a timber sales program with a focus on the value added section. Number 17, this is to continue to promote the use of wood and mass timber to improving our legislative framework to ensure that wood, mass timber, and emerging biomass-based materials are more clearly a priority in building public buildings. Number 18, which is one I believe you're well aware of, which is to revise the area-based forest tenure-specific pricing policy, looking to harmonize the rate structures consistent with our market-based pricing system, while being mindful that smaller tenure ownership is impacted by economies of scale. And number 19, we're almost there, strengthen compliance and enforcement reinforce our ability to address issues around poor practices and behavior, including public reporting of infractions and reviewing the existing fine and penalty amounts. And the last policy intention, number 20, is to protect good jobs. On this note, the government has already fulfilled one of the specific aspects of this policy intention with completion of the contractor sustainability review and subsequent amendments to the timber harvesting contractor and subcontractor regulation.
So, community forests are an integral part of our vision for a modern forest policy, and the CFAs have a natural connectivity to community vision and values and represent a strong source of local jobs and economic opportunity. You're also founded in strong forest values, many of which dovetail with government's goals of sustainability and fiber use. Improving accountability and tenure management is definitely a goal that in many ways is already hard baked into the CFA model. And finally, your commitment to First Nation partnership speaks to government's goal to support Indigenous held tenure. I recognize your membership have a particular interest in intentions paper item number 18 that Doug mentioned, which seeks to harmonize tab rates. And I urge you to pay careful attention to the wording of the intention. Currently, there is a disparity between stumpage rates applied to woodlot licenses, community forest agreements, and First Nation woodland licenses issued to Indigenous communities. We will harmonize the rate structures consistent with our market-based pricing system while being mindful that smaller tenure ownership is impacted by economies of scale, as Doug has already referred to. This does not say that tab rates will be eliminated, just that there is a need to harmonize approaches with these various programs. So we welcome the feedback of your association and your membership on this intention, but I would also encourage you to think about the many other themes and specific proposals in the intentions paper that have the potential to impact community forests. Some of these include government's intent to increase community participation in forestry and keeping jobs in local communities. We'll be looking at innovative ways to keep these jobs local, increasing fiber access for value-added domestic manufacturers to help diversify the industry, and strengthening compliance and enforcement, which will target bad actors, and in so doing increase social license for the majority of tenure holders who behave responsibly. I believe that community forests align favorably with these initiatives and encourage the association to consider how your values align with the government policy paper. So this slide is really just showing the first year at a glance. And as you can see, we've broken up the intentions paper into different phases, some of which are happening now. And you're going to certainly hear that from Rachel in just a moment. And other things are going to happen in the spring and then further into 2022 and beyond. So, it's a huge amount of change, a huge amount of work, but I think is extremely valuable. And I really do feel that it aligns with the values of community forests in British Columbia. Thanks very much.
Does that conclude your presentation?
Yes, it does.
Yes. Okay, thanks so much. So we just have a couple of minutes for some quick questions. Sarah has to leave at 9:30, but Doug will be remaining on, so we'll have more time in the fuller Q&A at the end of the session. So I do see in the chat, thanks for folks to put their questions in here. So the first one is from Gord Chipman, who is the manager of the Asketum First Nation Community Forest. And he asks, what's meant by cultural fire? What about good old-fashioned silviculture fire? So maybe Sarah or Doug, you can speak to that definition.
I think it includes both. To be honest, I don't think there's we want to improve the use of fire for silviculture preparation, but we also want to look at it in terms of the use of historical cultural practices. And so I do think it's improving both. And of course, this is with all the objective of reducing the wildfire risk throughout the province, which as we have seen this year and in the past decade is increasing, in particular in the urban-rural divide. And so I believe it does include both.
Okay, thanks for that, Doug. We've got a couple questions about the stumpage policy intention. And I think we can get into this in more detail at the end of the session. But Sarah, since you're here, maybe I'll just ask you this question from Ken Day, who is now the president of the board of the Williams Lake Community Forest. So Ken asked if you can talk about the complexity of managing small tenures next to communities and how that relates to pricing policy and the importance, I think what Ken is probably getting at, the importance that the tab rate pricing policy plays for community forests.
Yes, thanks for that question, and we will get into that a little bit later as well. But we understand that the size of community forests, you don't always have the same economies of scale as the larger tenure holders have, and so that's something that we really need to be considering in our policy work for the intentions paper. Completely understand the give back that community forests have for local economies and for local communities, and so we're aware of that and certainly are looking to that. And as the intentions paper says, part of this is about local decision making as well, and involving local communities, and that is an underlying value of what community forests do. So I don't know, Doug, if you want to add to that at all.
Sure, I would like to add that I think when you're looking at community forests, there's also a social forestry obligation that comes with the agreement. And I think it's important that that's recognized in the process. And I've heard that clearly in discussions, and we recognize that it's part of the tenure document process. So Ken, I think it's important to realize it's not just regular business like the majors have. There is a certain expectation and there's certain obligations that are incurred under a CFA.
Okay, thanks for those responses. And I'm encouraged so far and look forward to more conversation and dialogue. And certainly, I'm sure that all of our members have additional questions about this as we enter into these conversations. I just have one hopefully we can, it's probably not a quick answer, but Albert Giroux, who is a board member of the BCCFA and a former chief of the Burns Lake Band, speaks to the fact that most of BC is unceded lands of our First Nations people, of the First Nations people that have lived here since time immemorial. And so I think he says, our belief is the forest do not belong to all British Columbians, but rather we look forward to increasing joint management of natural resources. Can you let us know where government is at with respect to engaging First Nations at the senior level? Thank you.
Yes, thanks for that, Al. And, you know, I think that underlying all of this is the moving ahead with reconciliation and the importance of working together. So I certainly know what you're saying here. And there are many discussions that are going on at senior level. And so there's discussions that are going on with rights and title holders. There's discussions that are going on with the First Nation Leadership Council and the First Nation Forestry Council as well. And so those are continuing. Certainly there were engagement sessions over the summer with Indigenous people and organizations, and those are continuing. So those will continue through the fall in many different aspects, you know, generally the intentions paper, but in each of the areas of the intentions paper. And you would have seen in the old growth report that the number one item in that, the recommendation was to work with Indigenous people. And so we are doing that. I know that that's not a really thorough answer, but there are ongoing conversations.
Thank you for that, Sarah. And thank you, Sarah and Doug. We're going to now move on to the next presenter, Rachel Pollard. And for those that have questions in the chat, those will stay there, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to them at the end of the session. I'd like to introduce Rachel Pollard, who's Acting Director of Resource Practices Branch. Rachel's going to talk to us about the changes to FRPA, the Forest and Range Practices Act, how it's being changed to better align with the provisions of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and also the introduction of Bill 23, the Forest Statutes Amendment Act, which was just introduced yesterday. So Rachel, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I also want to, so nice to be here. Nice to see everyone. I want to just introduce my colleague, Leith McKenzie. Many of you probably know Leith. She right now is just, she's sitting in the room with me, and she is the acting manager of sustainable resource management. So she's leading the FRPA team, who are working so hard to update the FRPA legislation, bring the bill forward that yesterday. I'll talk more about that, and get ready for all the regulatory work in front of us. And both Leith and I are joining today from Secwepemcúlecw, which is in Kamloops, in the heart of Secwepemc territory. So grateful to live, work, and play here. Actually, we're in Victoria today, but in general, we're in Kamloops. And the reason we're in Victoria is because, as Jennifer mentioned, maybe some of you saw it on the news, yesterday, government introduced Bill 23 into the House for the first reading. And so we were here to support that work and also get to watch it from the gallery, which was very, very exciting. We've come and made at least several presentations to you, probably more than that over the past few years, relating to the FRPA Improvement Initiative and planned improvements and amendments to the Forest Range Practices Act. And it's so exciting to be able to come today and say, the new bill was introduced in the House. I know that there were some questions from folks about whether that would happen. And so we're just really, really pleased and excited to see this important step come forward. And so we're looking forward to the next steps, which are, of course, second and potentially third reading, and hopefully all leading to royal assent before too long. This is my first time going through a legislation process like this. So I'm not positive about timelines, but I understand it should, if all goes well, it should be in the next week or so. That's about right. And so with that in mind, I wanted to, so that was Jennifer wanted me to announce that. We're super excited. And I wanted to just provide you a very high level reminder of what's in the bill and kind of how it fits with the overall improvement initiative and what's next. Jennifer, you'll just jump in if I'm missing anything important. And so, of course, you already know what Forest Range Practices Act is, so I won't go through that, but I did want to make the point that, aside from some tweaks, FRPA has not been substantially improved since it was introduced in 2002. I think bill amendments in 2003 to replace the Forest Practices Code. And so government committed to improving the Forest Range Practices Act in 2018. There was a pretty significant public engagement process, and targeted engagement with and consultation, of course, with First Nations rights and title holders, and at a provincial level, as well as, I believe, engagement with many important groups such as the BC Forest Association. That commitment to improving FRPA was reinforced last fall in the ministry's mandate letter. If you haven't read that, you might be interested too. We can provide some links to that. And then also more recently in the Modernizing Forest Policy intentions paper that Sarah and Doug just spoke to. So government has continued to reinforce the commitment to improving the Forest Range Practices Act. And really, the message that they continue to give is that the proposed changes really support government's long-term vision that you've heard about for stewardship, economic well-being, and a continued commitment to reconciliation. And you've heard that commitment as well from Doug and Sarah. And so, at a high level, these changes and you've probably heard about this, are really intended to strengthen the role of Indigenous nations in forest planning and decision-making. Repositioning government as the land manager, and I think it's probably a little bit different in terms of your role as community forest managers and the way that we work together. It's about reasserting the public interest in forest management, and I know that that's something community forests are different, right? You're special, and so that's already top of mind for you, and you're working hard on that. And then finally, just equipping land managers. So us, all of you, with those tools for resilient forest and addressing climate change. And that really, the highlight there is the new landscape level forest landscape planning. And so first bucket, I'll just mention Susan and Jennifer, I can't see any of the chat while I'm sharing my screen. So if someone wants to ask a question, you'll shout out, interrupt.
You betcha, Rachel. And I'll keep an eye on it and we can ask some questions at the end of your presentation.
That sounds great. And Leith indicated she's in IT, so that's wonderful. Thanks. So the proposed amendments that kind of fall into that reconciliation and alignment with the Declaration Act bucket really are about strengthening the role of Indigenous nations in forest planning and decision making, and really in better enabling that government to government collaboration in forest management. So specific improvements are new opportunities for shared decision making, especially tied to the forest landscape plan. There's a requirement to work in consultation and cooperation in the development of the forest landscape plan. There's a requirement for consent in the development of the forest landscape plan and subsequent plans. And there's also a new standalone objective relating to inclusion and incorporation of indigenous values, traditional knowledge, and objectives in the specific to the forest landscape plans. This is stuff that we probably wouldn't have done anyways, but it's it's important to see that enshrined in the legislation. So that first bucket. Second bucket is really these new tools to establish resilient forests. So as I mentioned, the proposed amendments to FRPA will establish a new forest landscape planning framework. We've come to talk to you about that before. Happy to, now that it's a reality, or hopefully will be a reality very soon, I'm happy to come back anytime to talk more about any aspect of the changes to the bill, and thought that the one you might be really interested in talking about is the forest landscape planning. And of course, you have a FRPA subcommittee, and so we've already met with that group and are looking forward to doing more work as we go forward. There's also some tools that will help us improve the existing forest stewardship planning framework. Some of those things have greater or lesser applicability to forests, but thought you would all be interested in what those are, because of course, forest landscape planning framework we anticipate will take about 10 years to roll out across the province. We can't do forest landscape plans everywhere at once, much the same as a timber supply review process. So we're going to be in the existing forest stewardship planning framework for, probably a decade, maybe a little bit more through that transition period. And we want to make sure that we can do the things that we need to do under the existing regime as well. There's some new tools to make sure that those forest management practices can reflect the public interest and really respond to climate change. And lucky to have my colleague Leith here, who has significant expertise in the climate change. So Leith, thanks for being here, Leith. These amendments will also support government's ability to manage and respond to wildfires in the sort of wildfire planning and response side, but also really importantly ensuring a timely and effective wildfire reforestation. So two different things there that you might be interested in. And then finally, this is Doug's area of expertise. So if there's any questions, I will turn them to Doug, but enhancing government's ability to have management control over forest roads, specifically around protecting public safety and the environment. And then finally, third bucket is really changes in the Act that will strengthen transparency of forest management and also increase both public trust, which are goals and objectives of government. And probably the biggest thing there is the forest landscape planning framework. That framework, with all of its engagement opportunities, will enable that greater engagement from the people who want to be part of forest management in their local areas, stakeholders, Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, and the public. And that's through the development of the forest landscape plan itself, and then also the subsequent plans. So fairly soon, once the regulatory work is done, that would be the forest operations map. And I know that you've already been talking with Julius Hughes to understand what the FOM is, and using that, hopefully we'll see many of you using that as a best practice. And then once we transition to the forest landscape planning framework, that FOM becomes FOP, which is a forest operations plan, which is an approvable plan, but really allows anyone who wants to see where planned blocks and roads are consistent with the overarching forest landscape plan. Second piece of work or changes, amendments relating to transparency and public trust are, of course, strengthening compliance and enforcement. So there's a few existing pieces in FRPA related to fines, fees, and transparency around public reporting of contravention fines and convictions. And I think I said already, increased fees. So there's those pieces. And then there's also expanded authorities allowing government to charge fees relating to the use or occupation of public land. And so that's things, special use permits, logging camps, that sort of thing, where we haven't necessarily, the people of BC haven't necessarily derived the benefit from those lands. So those are kind of at a very, very high level. Those are the buckets and some of the key changes. And that's what I have. And I'm just going to stop sharing the presentation so I can see everybody and the chat window. And so maybe what I'll just say is, so those at a high level, those are the proposed amendments still proposed until that act is passed and receives royal assent. And once that happens, we want to really, or need to dive into the regulations. We won't be able to do all of the regulations at the same time. So we'll be looking to see which are the most important from the perspective of government and the minister, as well as, you know, important stakeholders. So we'll be interested in hearing your thoughts on that. But really our goal, this is just to set the stage, to say that our goal will be to work closely with your FRPA subcommittee on understanding the Act, understanding what it means for community forests, and understanding what regulatory things are most important and working on. Yeah.
Rachel, thanks so much for that. It's a lot to pack into a short period of time. I think some of the things that I would want to highlight for everyone who's joining us this morning is that, as Rachel said, BCCFA does have a FRPA working group, and we've now, with the introduction of this legislation, we're looking forward to working with Rachel and her team, really to figure out how this is all going to work for community forests. Because as Rachel said, you know, community forests are special. Thank you for saying that. And you know, we have to figure out how to adopt these new planning frameworks in such a way that doesn't create too great of a burden, an administrative burden for community forests. So that's something that the working group is going to be tackling and looking for input from BCCFA members. We'll be coming out with questions and really trying to provide good feedback. Something else I would mention, I'm not sure that it came through, Rachel, is just the fact that the bill that was introduced in the legislature yesterday is really enabling. And so this is going to take time, and for forest landscape plans to come into force, the regulation has to be developed. So none of this is happening quickly. However, the first FRPA bill, Bill 21, was the one that enabled the forest operations maps. And we've been working through our subgroup to look at what those requirements will be, again, once they come into regulation, and that hasn't happened yet. So I don't see any questions in the chat at the moment. So I think in the interest of time, Rachel, I'll just see if you have any concluding remarks, and then we'll move on to Margaret.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And maybe I'll just quickly mention one of the things that you had asked me about, Jennifer, was what does, you know, how do forest landscape plans apply to community forests? So I could just say at a high level, again, the Act is very enabling and we need to work on the regulations, but at a high level, smaller community forests, so that's less than 800 hectares on the coast, less than 1,200 hectares in the interior, will not be subject to the forest landscape plan regime. Those smaller community forests will continue to be subject to the woodlot license plan regime. Those larger ones will be subject to a forest landscape plan regime once all the regulations are complete. And the thing that we really need to work on, or there's a number of options on how that could happen. A community forest doing its own forest landscape plan, being part of a forest landscape plan in an adjacent TSA, or some combination of that. So lots of opportunities. We've already started talking about that with the FRPA subcommittee. But really, the only other thing I wanted to say is thanks so much. Excited to be doing this work with you, and just want to just express our desire for ongoing partnership. And we'll be here till 9:30.
Okay, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel and Leith. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce Margaret Gibbs. Margaret is the Director of Provincial Stewardship Strategies in the Ministry of Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. And Margaret's now going to give us an update on the latest work to implement the recommendations of the Old Growth Strategic Review. So Margaret, over to you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today. I'm joining you from the territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nation, and I'm just honored to be able to work and play on this beautiful land. I'd like to start off by giving a quick recap of the work of the independent panel, the Old Growth Strategic Review, led by Gary Merkel and Al Gorley, and just quickly go over the 14 recommendations that their report came up with. Then we'll talk about the stage approach we're taking to implementation of the recommendation, and with a real focus on the recent work on recommendations 5 and 6 of the report and what we've been doing for them. And then we'll do a quick overview of the stepwise approach and moving on. So I hope that's good. So the Old Growth Strategic Review broke it down, its recommendations, setting out a path on how we work towards changes in old growth management. They used 3 categories that you can see here. Immediate measures needed now, elements that are needed to support the change, and components that will make up a modern old growth strategy. So now might be a good time just to quickly address a couple of considerations about the recommendations. It looks really simple on paper, but they are much more fulsome and complex than these categories suggest. And so we may have started on this work. The reality is that many recommendations are highly connected to others, and we anticipate that the work will continue over the entire timeframe of the Old Growth Strategic Review. So even if you see something in the first column, which are immediate measures, the expectation is that they're ongoing and inexplicably linked to each other. 4 components that need to be part of phase 1, you'll see on the left. The first and foremost, as was mentioned earlier, is the commitment to partnership with Indigenous Nations, fundamental in the Old Growth Report, and really will drive and continue throughout the work of the Old Growth Strategic Review implementation. Recommendation number 5, commitment to improving public data and information. And while much of the recommendation is about reporting on old growth conditions, we recognize that we needed to begin with better basic information on BC's old forests. There's a lot of misinformation, conflicting data, and we needed to provide a much more robust source of information. And we'll talk quite a bit about that in today's presentation. Recommendation 6 is about deferrals and about pausing harvesting in key areas to create the space to work on the rest of the recommendations. I really want to emphasize that this is a pause on harvesting to give us time to have conversations and to do some really good work. Recommendation 7, you'll have heard this with both of my colleagues' presentations previously. It's around compliance and enforcement, moving to address compliance issues where they may exist, understanding that we didn't need to wait for this to happen. We can examine compliance issues immediately. So that's why it's in the first column. As you move to the second column, you see that we have prioritized ecosystem health, more inclusive governments, framework for setting and managing targets, transition plans, local and provincial, and transition support for communities. So some of my esteemed colleagues that were on today are part of the recommendation groups for especially 13 and 14. And so you'll see that all of these initiatives that you're hearing about today are linked together, and we're really working in concert. Today we're focused on the first column. Oh, sorry. Then the last column is modernizing old growth strategy. And those will involve some things such as 3-zone management, funds for monitoring and evaluation, updated biodiversity targets and guidance, better inventory and classification, and more innovative practices. So that's sort of the middle column builds towards the end column, but all of these are linked together. So we are starting work on recommendation working groups to set in place the framework for doing all of this work across starting now and ongoing into the summer, fall, and then into 2023 and forward, with the end game of coming out with a new modernized old growth strategy in 2023. Now, as I said, we're going to focus primarily on recommendation 5 and 6 in this presentation, and that's because we've recently introduced an old growth technical advisory panel. And we've established the panel to identify where and when and why we should be thinking about deferrals on the land base. So we've focused on deferring areas of imminent risk of irreversible biodiversity loss. That's our critical in the first column that you saw previously. So to that end, we've engaged a technical advisory panel to support with maps, analysis, and detailed status of old growth ecosystems in British Columbia, and to provide to improve public information across the full land base. The panel is composed of Gary Merkel, who is a co-author of the Old Growth Strategic Review Report, Rachel Holt, Karen Price, and Dave Doust, who have done some work, being quite prolific in their work on old growth, and have produced some public reports that you probably are aware of, and also Lisa Matthias from Organizing for Change. And the reason we brought these folks together is because there is some, as I said earlier, some different methodologies out there, some confusion around data reporting and such. And so we thought it would be essential for us to bring these folks who have experience alongside government technical experts, and to work together to provide that increased public solid information, so folks get a clear picture of what is on the land base regarding old growth. And so their work will be to provide recommendations for priority areas for the implementation of deferrals, focused on the timber harvest land base. Oh, sorry.
Margaret, I'm just going to jump in here. You just have 2 or 3 more minutes, just in terms of timing. Sorry, I hate to rush you.
That's okay. I will figure it out. Okay. And you'll hear more. Honestly, you'll hear more about this, much like the work of my colleagues. You'll hear more about this in the future, and we can do a separate briefing if you need so. So that's fine.
Thank you.
So the TAP process, what they basically did is they worked with government, and they confirmed some data sources, tested assumptions. They worked with the ministry technical staff to assemble data as methodologies. So again, trying to provide clear understanding of what old growth is out in the land base, and make some recommendations that will form the basis for starting government to government conversations in the regions with Indigenous Nations. Right now, we're interacting by doing in technical briefings on the information that the TAP panel has provided. where we will be sharing some map products with Indigenous nations in order to further those conversations. And we'll be setting engages approaches suited to each nation, government to government focused on deferrals on old growth through existing engagement forms and mechanisms already in place, and following established protocols such as those in treaty agreements. Once agreements between the province and nations are in place, discussion of approaches will be made with licensees. And so next steps. The technical advisory panel is refining their work. It's largely complete. They're just doing some tweaks. Information and maps will be shared with the Indigenous nations. Deferral considerations will be ongoing, and discussions with industry on approaches and strategies will be following those Indigenous conversations. Ongoing Indigenous engagement will happen at a policy level, and then we'll quickly move to addressing remaining recommendations. And that is what I have for you today.
Margaret, thank you so much. Again, lots of new information for everyone to take in, and I appreciate the offer to, to do more in-depth technical briefings with BCCFA membership in the future. I think that's something that we'll definitely want to do. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to hold the questions. Margaret, you're able to stay through to the end of the session? Perfect. Yes. So I think we'll hold the questions then until the end and move on. So now I'd like to introduce Mick Wurstick and Dave Gill from the West Bank First Nation Community Forest. So Mick is the Community and Business Development Officer, and Dave Gill is the General Manager of Forestry of the West Bank First Nations Intitich Resources Limited Partnership. And they're going to talk about their landscape level plan that is guided by Indigenous values. So Dave and Mick, I turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Jennifer. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. Good morning, everyone. And we're honored to be able to share a little bit about how our community views, values, and stewards old forests. We're thankful for the opportunity. Mick Wurstick and I are going to tag team this presentation. Hopefully it goes well. We're in the same room, and we've already heard we look pretty cozy together. So we look forward to any questions at the end of the session. First of all, I just wanted to be clear that I'm not speaking directly for West Bank First Nations, but for Intitich Resources, a company fully owned by West Bank First Nation. Our perspectives include the ideas, the wisdom of WFN members, including elders, both within our community and within the greater Silk Nation, and those working with Intitich. We understand that our ideas, they might not work for everyone, and they might not work in every place. And nor do we think we have the answers to all the questions, but this is really where we are today. It's where we're thinking, and I guess at least it's a place to start. So rather than age, what we feel more important about Old Forest is how that forest functions in providing values that are associated with what we call old forests. And for us, these values are different. They're different across our community forests. For example, near the Okanagan Valley bottom, old forests may have value for mule deer or medicinal plants and recreation, while some of our older forests higher up on the landscape have value for marten or tea from balsam bark or regulating watershed peak flows, that kind of thing. So we've been using science and Indigenous knowledge to help us understand the variety of values that old forests provide and where on the landscape it's important to have them. Human activities have and will continue to impact old forests. We've got lots of examples of that, I guess, like Climate change is probably one of the more significant aspects. Down here, we're seeing a shift in the geographic ranges of some of our species. For example, lodgepole pine. Insect outbreaks, catastrophic wildfires, and drought. Another example is fire management over the last 100 years and how that's affected our old growth stands. And invasive species such as gypsy moth and white pine blister rust and their impacts on old forests. But in our opinion, not all human activities affecting old forests are necessarily bad. Indigenous stewardship practices have coexisted with old forests for thousands of years. Old forests, particularly in our part of the world, need to be cared for. That means addressing wildfire and forest health. If we want old forests around here, we have to tend them by enhancing the fire resilience of these stands and managing for forest health. We do that, either that or let natural processes take their course, and we see what happens with that. So how do we ensure we have old forests 7 generations from now? One of the things I learned from our community is to think ahead 7 generations before making a decision on the land. What will be the consequence of that decision 120 to 150 years from now? For me, it's been a powerful paradigm shifting experience, one that's taken most of my career to realize. So how much old forest do we want on the land? Well, we all understand the importance of that old forest and big trees, but we also know that there are benefits both environmentally and ecologically in having a mosaic of forest stands with different ages and different characteristics across the landscape. So for us, how much depends on the old forest values of our community, what they want us to maintain or enhance in the long term, and balanced with the values associated with our younger forests. So where are the best places for these old forests? Well, for us, they're where they provide the most benefit for those non-timber values that we want to maintain or enhance. Right now, those values are most often tied to water. Areas associated with high wildlife habitat and areas close to the community. There are also previously harvested areas within our community forest where we want to recruit old forests, where we want to bring back some of those values to the landscape that were lost with areas harvested. We now have spatially established our old forest areas across our community forest. So our next step is to figure out how we are going to protect and maintain them. 90% of our community forest is in natural disturbance types 3 and 4. And as you know, these are fire-dominated ecosystems where old forests are not necessarily that common or are adapted to frequent low-intensity fires. So our stewardship principles have to focus on increasing that fire resiliency and managing the health of those stands to keep them around. And we're doing that through low-intensity treatments in these areas. That's kind of an introduction to our way of thought. I'll now pass it over to my colleague and good friend, Mick.
So, as they said, old forests, like that's a big question. What is old forest? This is what our interpretation of old forest is. There's a lot of other things, that, attributes and so forth. Maybe it doesn't meet sort of definitions, strict definitions of age class and size and all of these things, but with, as Dave said, within the Okanagan, the central interior, an old forest has a lot of different functions and perspectives, and we want to talk about the values, the non-timber values, and also about the forest itself. So the first picture you guys see here, I hope, is a lot of, probably in the central interior, southern interior. This is pretty much a stand you see all over the place. Yellow pine, IDF, DK2, there's trees in there, 155 years to over 200 years, the yellow pine. And it meets all the criteria of what's considered, could be considered old growth. But as you see, there's a lot of ingress because of fire suppression, so forth. The stand is pretty dense. It meets other values for ungulate winter range and so forth. But if that stand was just left alone and cordoned off and designated as an ogma with no management practice, in the Okanagan, that would more than likely burn up, and that would result in a catastrophic fire, and you'd lose all of those attributes through fire. Next one is something that I'm pretty proud of. I think I had a hand in actually doing this work. Is a stand that's been some wildfire mitigation work back in 2017. It's not multiple layered. A lot of the coarse debris has been removed, but it still meets ungulate winter range requirements. One of the other things is identified in here. This is actually early in the spring, so later on the season, probably right about now, it looks probably pretty lush and green underneath in the understory there, and you can see some old stumps in there that are probably over 100 years old or so forth. So this stand does not sort of meet the overall criteria of what an old forest or old growth is, but it has the attributes of, and it can be recruited to maintain those attributes of an old growth forest. Here's another one. As you can see, this one was actually harvested. The previous one was fuel mitigation work. This one was actually harvested. About 40% of the basal area was removed, and that was just last year in 2020. The average trees are 125 years old in that picture, and it is within the mule deer winter range, so it does meet those objectives. And but there was an opportunity where there was some commercial viability. It didn't cover all the costs, or it was close to break even, I guess, in regards to overall harvesting. But there's other values, as we were saying, that are more than economic when identifying these stands. And then this one here, same thing. I like to pat myself on the back every opportunity I can. This is the Mount Wildfire that we just recently had. Fuel mitigation work was done up there in 2016. And through that fuel mitigation work that was stated by local fire officials, BC Wildfire Service, that this work was instrumental in knocking the fire down. It went, to quote them, that fire went from a roar to being quiet when it got to this fuel mitigation work. These values, not just West Bank First Nations, SEALs values, but protecting the values of the whole community of West Kelowna, the non-native community. The work that we do has an impact of as a community force, not just West Bank First Nation, but the community in general. So we're proud of the work that we did up there, and it still continues to provide those old forest features within that area, despite a fire going through there. And this one here, higher level ESSF, meets all the, much like the first picture that we showed, meets all the criteria in which meets old growth forest and so forth. But as you can see, a lot of fuel loading, that type of stuff. You can see a lot of dead balsam in there. And something that we have to do is continuously go in there instead of what's been done in the past of designating areas, just putting a fence around them and not managing them and not stewarding them in the manner that will maintain those values. I saw one of the earlier comments on the chat. What about dead old growth management areas? Well, that's what we're trying to mitigate, is having what I didn't get to coin the term, but I like using it. What about dogmas? Dead old growth management areas, and how do you manage those? So this is something, these are things that within our planning we want to steward in the future to ensure that they maintain those values as best as possible and continue fire resilience as we go forward. I'll turn it back over to Dave. Thanks.
Thanks, Mick. So right now we've got we've been working on for actually several years now, a West Bank First Nation 7th generation stewardship plan. And this is a community-driven plan. It's a landscape level plan built on community values. And it's a very different way of making decisions on the land. The premise of the plan is that all things are connected and that good decisions come from knowing the land and understanding its needs. Old forests are but one of the values contained within the plan. And based on what we've learned, for lack of a better term, we've zoned the land base into two different zones. One that we call our Old Forest Stewardship Zone, and one that we call our Forest Operations Stewardship Zone. So the Forest Operations Stewardship Zone is managed for multiple values, including timber production. This is the zone that we rely on for timber harvesting, for economic and employment opportunities. It's the land base that we will use for our next TSR, and it's the area where we conduct all of our incremental activities such as spacing, pruning, and pretty soon some commercial thinning. The Old Forest Stewardship Zone is managed primarily for non-timber values. Though we don't rely on this area to consistently provide timber, we will from time to time extract timber from this zone related to fire resiliency and forest health management practices. This is a map of a portion of our community forest on the west side of Okanagan Lake. And this outlines the zoning that we've done on this part of our community forest. The area in green is our Old Forest Stewardship Zone, and the area in yellow is our Forest Operations Stewardship Zone. In our community forest, the Old Forest Stewardship Zone accounts for 54% of our land base. Now, zooming in a little bit closer, you can see that you see some different colors on this particular map. Not all of our Old Forest Stewardship Zone is presently old forest. The yellow on the map is early cereal. The light green is mid cereal, and there's some meadows, but I don't know, the same color for meadows. I don't think there are any here. And the dark green is old cereal. There's a little patch of deciduous and orange up there as well. At present, approximately 20% of our Old Forest Stewardship Zone does not support old forest values. But again, looking through the lens of that 7th generation plan, these are areas that we feel in the long term are important to have old forests growing on them. And we envision these areas to be supporting old forests in 120 to 150 years. Of course, we recognize that the plan will change. Stuff will happen. The plan itself will never be done. It will constantly be evolving, and in essence, the plan itself will be stewarded. There's a lot more that we could cover, but to keep it within our timelines, just in summary, our community wants old forests that are easily accessible, that provide protection of water, of medicines and food, and provide for wildlife and recreation. Our community wants balance between old forests and forests that provide economic returns, employment, and social benefits. We have a vision, we have a plan on where we want to see old forests now and in the future. And we understand that our forests, both old and young, need to be cared for. Intervention will be required at times to protect old forests, to recruit younger cohorts, and to manage forest health. And we'll do this using locally developed principles suited to the land and modified as we learn or as the needs of our community changes. That's all we have for you right now, and we look forward to any questions you may have. From Mick and I, Lim, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Dave and Mick. That was terrific. I think, again, just because we are running a little over time in the progress of presentations, not your fault, mine, I'm going to just move on to the next presentation, and then we'll have hopefully some lively Q&A time at the end. So now I'd like to introduce Colin McLeod and David DeWitt from the Office of Wet'suwet'en. Both of them are members of the Wet'suwet'en Community Forest, which is in and around Smithers, and they are going to speak about their old growth policy that guides management decisions on their community forests. So Colin and Dave, I'll turn it over to you.
Masai, Jennifer. Howdy y'all, Bin Hanzu, good day. It's an honor to be here. I just want to introduce myself. It's Takan Hulat Sydney, G. Irene Brown Bakai. Here with Colin McLeod, a fellow director of the Wet'suwet'en Community Forest that's been a director since inception. I'm David DeWitt. I'm also a director, and I've been on the Wet'suwet'en Community Board since inception, but I also hold a role as the Natural Resources Manager for the Office of the Wet'suwet'en. And I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm beaming in here from Wet'suwet'en territory, Cassia Clan territory, so that's the Grizzly House. And just wanted to acknowledge the territory and all the territories that people are coming here from. And like I said, it's an honor to present and share our journey of our path in managing our forests, our landscape, and water together for the betterment of all. So I hand it over to Colin.
Thank you, David. So we were asked by Susan and Jennifer just to share a little bit of our journey. And again, we're definitely, we're just getting started. It's a work in progress as far as the old growth policy, but just sort of this is a snapshot of, and I guess just an example highlighting where community forests have that potential just to play a role in being nimble. We're the local folks, and just have that ability to be adaptive, to be responsive. And when something comes up that is new or unexpected, whether it's a crisis or whether it's a new policy or just new values and changing values, that community forests have that ability to adapt and be nimble and make those changes quickly. So with respect to the old growth, and again, it's a policy and work in progress, but when we became aware of the old growth deferral maps and the issues regarding growth, and realize that there are overlap and there's areas within our Wet'suwet'en Community Forest tenure that were designated sort of potential for this old growth deferral. As a board, we had a discussion in the summer, and pretty much at that meeting just made the recommendation that we defer any of those spots that we didn't want to make a mistake, and that we defer until we had the opportunity to actually get out on the ground, verify what was there and what these things looked like, and just make sure that we didn't remove something that would have long-term consequences that was just not something we wanted to do. It was put to our manager and our forest operations forester, and sure enough, there were 3 plots that had already been approved to harvest that were for the coming winter that had overlapping with these old growth deferral potential. And so as a board, it was just basically, I think it was within a week or two, we had a field trip coordinated with board members, with our operations forester, to actually get boots on the ground, to look at these sites, and then to verify and see whether what was there and what we had planned was also within, what was. We didn't want to make a mistake. So I'll just pass to Dave, because he was actually there on the field trip and sort of share what we found on the ground.
Yep. Thank you, Colin. And thank you for that primer there, Colin. I think this is an example of both a community forest management structure being able to be nimble, but it's also an opportunity for Wet'suwet'en Authority to interface with forest management through the community forest. And that kind of touches upon a comment that Albert Giroux mentioned, that the landscape is changing in BC, in an Indigenous country. And the community forests, I just want to highlight, are an opportunity to dispel the fears that government industry may have when Indigenous authority interfaces with the asserted Western governments. I think we're living, breathing examples of forms of reconciliation. And I think we shouldn't undervalue that. I think we are living examples of operational solutions. So yeah, to go back into the old growth deferral areas, this is our tenure area for the Wet'suwet'en Community Forest. It's 33,000 hectares. When the old growth management deferral areas came out, the directors wanted to see how that impacted our immediate operations, and understanding that these old growth deferral areas were based on the VRI, the Vegetation Resource Inventory. We know, our forest managers know that the VRI has its use probably at that small scale or large regional levels. But if you use that data set to manage a smaller forest tenures, the resolution isn't there. And so Colin mentioned that some directors, myself, our forestry manager, and went out and to walk some of the blocks that we had scheduled for immediate harvest, because that's where the biggest concern is where these old growth deferral areas interfaced with this year's harvest. So we walked four blocks, and we found that some of the VRI information, it has its variability. There was some misinterpretations of leading species, heights. So it was very important for us to get our boots on the ground and realize that boots on the ground and better information is very important to our management. So out of the 4 blocks we visited, 1 was deferred and 3 were still scheduled to harvest. Like I said, that a little bit of misinterpretation from VRI kind of resulted in there being a higher level of I guess what is the best and better deferred areas. But we had to manage some wildfire risk there. The VRI was showing that there was spruce leading stands that were a lot taller than what was actually there. We had pine leading stands that were dead. There was root rot. They were falling over. They were on south facing slopes and adjacent to cabin communities. So we felt that in the interests of managing for public safety and managing our tenure, that much like how Dave and Mick presented, that we really need to be defining the old growth characteristics that we want to maintain on the landscape and balance those with community health and safety, forest health and safety. But we did identify some areas that we were going to defer, and that led to other actions that in our community forest, I don't know if there's a slide there, Colin, that shows the landscape corridors. We operate in an area where the LRMP defines some spatial areas for core ecosystem networks and core ecosystem corridors, which offer some benefits, but also offer some constraints in managing our forest timber. These landscape corridors were developed probably 20 years ago, and we now have better information, and we have the impetus to do more ground truthing surveys to better define old growth management areas in combination with cultural values, cultural corridors. We have trail networks within this community forest. There's certain ecosystems that are conducive to maintaining salmon spawning habitats and regulating stream flows and temperatures in this areas. And we also have other significant forest types and ecosystems that support wildlife species there. So again, some of our thoughts right now are kind of paralleling what Dave and Mick talked about, is really knowing your tenure, your forest, looking at what you want to be maintaining, and developing processes, systematic processes to systematically attain that information. So we're embarking on a concept that we're hoping can be implementing this summer, is to be using our general management company and young Wet'suwet'en staff, also from our Young Guardian program, to start field ground truthing and doing some surveys and reclassifying stand structure, leading species, the understory, to give us better information to plan ahead. And from the sounds of it, wanted to commend Dave and Mick for what they're doing and their tenure. It sounds like you already got spatially developed areas, and we're in a work in progress. We kind of wanted to do our due diligence and ensuring that we weren't going to be harvesting old growth stands that were underrepresented on our landscape that had very important values. And we just wanted to present on our experience of being able to identify a burning issue and come up with some solutions, realizing that we don't have the best available information to make decisions on, but it's important for us to do our due diligence and make a plan to plan forward with that. And with this new information, our long-term goals are to really take a look and reassess some of these landscape corridors that are on the landscape and determine that or evaluate, or if those landscape corridors are preserving ecosystem functions that they were intended to 20 years ago, and use some of our new information like LiDAR and some of this new ground truthing information to plan ahead and with better resolution for our current and future interests. So I'll pass it back over to you there, Colin.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks, Dave, for the great summation there. And I think that's David already spoke to that. Short term, the plan is just to make sure we don't make any errors and that we are ground truthing and making sure that these areas areas are going to be there for the future. We're also, it was already discussed at the board to try and bring in some Wet'suwet'en youth that we can train them to be the eyes and the boots on the ground to ground truth some of these spots. And then more longer term, I guess it's trying to follow in the footsteps of what Dave and Mick were doing, and to welcome that partnership and the relationship building, and to bring in the neighbors that we have in our community forests, and to be able to work collaboratively, looking at the values and just the changing values. You know, the LRMP process that developed this thing is I think it was done with the best of intentions and the best of information at its time, but you know, that was before the pine beetle. That was before these crises that we're seeing with climate change. And it just seems like values have changed a lot, and they continue to change. It's definitely exciting times. And it's just exciting to be part of the community forest program, where it seems like we're right there in the midst of it and have this opportunity to to be the nimble folks on the ground that can make these adjustments as these changes unfold. And there was one quote that actually came from that Jennifer provided with the indicators report. Just the community forests demonstrate how challenges can be identified and overcome when local people make local decisions about local forests. And it's just definitely rings true.
Thank you so much, Colin. Wonderful presentations. Thank you, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay? Yep, okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentations and for sharing the work that you're doing in your community forest. It's so inspiring, and you understand that it's a work in progress, and yet it's just so good to see the leadership that you're taking, and that you can share that with everybody here today. So thank you so much. So stay on, and I'd like to invite the other members of the panel to unmute themselves, if you may. And I'd like to encourage people to put their questions in the chat. We did really well. We caught up on time, so thank you so much for that. And we actually have until 10:15 for some really good discussion. So I think what I'd like to suggest is that we start maybe with the old growth topic, and then we can work our way back through the presentations that were part of this session this morning. So I think if I can start, I guess I can because I'm the moderator. Margaret, I have a question for you. So Margaret, if you're able to unmute and respond to this kind of general question. Listening to both the examples that the community forest shared here and what they're doing to address old growth management within their tenures, how do you see that fitting with the implementation of the old growth strategic review recommendations? And specifically, I'm thinking about the plans for deferrals. So, we've talked about being developed, and that, of course, the recommendations will be going to First Nations for government to government conversation before more details are shared with licensees. But just based on what you've heard here from both the Wet'suwet'en and the West Bank community forests, how would you view the work that they're doing in light of the way that the next steps for your work are going to unfold?
A great question. Thank you, Jennifer. I was very excited to hear, especially when David and Colin were talking about, we don't want to make any mistake. We want to be cautious. We want to walk the land and confirm our understanding of the forest. So I guess what I'd say is, although the work of the technical advisory panel has created maps and prioritize some areas for discussion, it's not the only methodology to use. So we are well aware of, there are other things happening on the land that we just can't tell from our existing technology and such. We have updated our data sets to show an update on areas that, for instance, have been affected by fires and pine beetle and such. So there's an updated data set that has been used because as we all know, forests are not static, they change. The other important factor, and that speaks to bringing this to next steps to the individual nations and the regional staff, to bring in that understanding of traditional knowledge that can't be captured again by some of the technology and methods. So although we have these maps and they're based on one methodology, we are aware that it is part of the bigger picture. And so the short term is to put a pause, just as I believe Colin said, so that we're not making bad decisions. So put a pause on so we can have these longer conversations and explore the areas where there's already in place a really good management system. So don't mess with that. To have some of those conversations longer term, but to put the short term pause so that we are showing that we're protecting areas of risk of irreversible biodiversity loss right away. So the conversations and the decisions will happen at the local level with Indigenous governments. But it's part of that longer, and you have to then step back and look at the longer structure of all the recommendations taken into as a whole. We're not just slapping on some areas and then walking away. We're looking at prioritizing the ecosystem health and resilience. And I saw some of the questions in the chat around that. So I think what I hear is that you guys are doing exactly what we're hoping to do. And so we're not going to mess with the stuff that is working well. We'll have those discussions. But in terms of determining deferral areas, that is a government to government decision. And so we're putting that into the next step is to put that into the hands of the Indigenous governments to have those conversations.
Thank you, Margaret. That's really helpful and informative. And what would you see, for community forest looking to the near future? What would you see as the timeline of when they might expect then to be brought into the conversation?
Well, I mean, I wish I had my psychic pants on in terms of timelines. Different areas, there may be areas where folks know that they need to have a deferral right away. There may be longer conversations. Timelines are going to be varied. What is also going to happen concurrently is a larger engagement process around policy and some of those more higher level rather than site-specific conversations. And so we're working right now on putting together an engagement strategy that will involve local communities, local governments, labor, et cetera, et cetera. So that will happen over the next 6 months or so. Start to do engagement a little bit more broadly level, point out. And so the government to government discussions will be pretty soon. And some will be really quick. Some conversations, and some of this will take longer discussions and some ground truthing, right? Like you say, get out, walk the area, talk about the cultural and traditional people we haven't taken into account. So.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just going to summarize another sort of set of questions that were in the chat earlier, which I think really has to do with natural disturbance regimes and parts of the province that have frequent fire. And, as Dave and Mick described in their community forest situation. So how could you describe the way that natural disturbance regimes and also the need of community forests in particular to be proactive in helping to protect their communities from the wildfire? How's integrated?
So I think that's part of the longer term conversation, right? Right now we're just focused on getting those immediate biodiversity loss and innovative silviculture system. All those kinds of conversations are set up as part of the recommendations from the Old Growth Strategic Review. So, at this point, we've set up the framework for having conversations. We've set up the three sort of different timelines. And those conversations will start to be brought into that higher level engagement that we'll have talking about policy options and such.
Wonderful. Okay, I'll let you off the hook, and we will, for now anyway, and we'll see what other questions I've got here in the chat. Steve Lorimer from the Quillayet Community Forest on Vancouver Island, he has a question about forest landscape plans. And I may be able to answer this, and Doug Kelly, maybe you can too. So his question is, what opportunity or role will tenure holders have in the development of these plans? So my understanding is that the planning begins with government to government discussions between the province and the local First Nations whose traditional territory we're talking about. And then basically working groups, or I'm not exactly sure what they'll be called, will be formed of the licensees and technical advisors. So it'll be, the plans will be really jointly developed or co-developed by those that have an interest, and also the rights holders, but stakeholders on that land base. What we've talked about for community forests, and those of you that were with us at the Mission BCCFA conference in 2019 will remember Diane Nichols and her team talking about these concepts, is that CFAs may want to do their own plans. They may not want to be part of a larger plan that's done for the TSA. I knew my dog would bark. And so we're exploring how that could work. If a community forest could create its own forest landscape plan that is connected to the plan of the larger area. So we will get into that more as we learn about the legislation. And Steve, as Rachel said, we can certainly hold specific webinars or discussions virtually on that topic. Doug, did you want to say anything in response to that?
No, Jen, you did a great job, I believe. If I look at the pilots that are going on, that are setting up to how to establish this, tenure holders clearly have a process, a position within moving forward on terms of the landscape planning framework. And I think it will depend exactly what it looks like by TSA, how the CFAs rolls in it. But clearly there's a need for existing tenure holders and future to be participating in the landscape level planning process. So I think you nailed it.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Okay, now that you're here, I've got a question for you. This one comes from Marley Tudor, and Marley says, I'd love to see more land and AAC allocated to expanding the community forest program, both in creating new CFAs and increasing the land base of existing ones. It seems like the intention paper hints at this and a take back from major licensees. Could you elaborate on if this is actually part of the plan?
There's no plan perceived in terms of reallocation or how it will be directed into different types of tenures, or even how new tenures. How AAC would be freed up to be distributed. What we're doing right now is enabling the process to get there, and then I think you've got to look at it. And I really like to draw it down to the local level in terms of. What does better look like? How are we going to meet the Premier's objection in terms of reconciliation moving forward, stronger communities and the like? So the tools are going to be created, but I think the process and the objectives have to be done at a local level, involving all members of the community, as opposed to a corporate measure that's coming out of Victoria. So we're creating the tools, but I think it has to be driven locally.
Okay, thanks for that, Doug. There are certainly some questions about stumpage and IP18. And one of them was just simply, when do you expect this, what's the timeline, and when do you expect a decision to be made?
I can speak to this in some more detail, because of course I didn't get a chance in the conversation. So What we've heard in the first phase of engagement with First Nations is that the following: there's clearly under the existing tenure and pricing model, there's clearly a disincentive to holding a First Nation woodland license relative to a CFA or woodlot. That all three of these area-based tenures have increased costs due to economies of scale, and that there are greater social objectives associated with these tenures. And what we've also clearly heard is the CFAs and woodlot holders and communities who benefit from these tenures, support continuing this existing policy. And lastly, that if there are any changes, they need to be phased in. This is going to take some time, folks. First of all, we need to engage and we need to identify the clear issues. I would say the intentions are looking forward. A future state will be harmonizing rate structures. We want to make sure we maintain the integrity of the market pricing system. And we do need to recognize the economies of scale and the social objectives. So I view this as not something that's going to happen in the next year or so. I think it's going to take time. FRPA, bill was just introduced today. I've been working on road components of FRPA since, most recently for the last 5 years. Change of this magnitude doesn't happen overnight. And I do recognize whatever change is going to have take some time to get there and be done properly. Any changes that require more reliance on a different model for MPS, for instance, will require surveys. Those are 1 or 2 years out if we go down that path. And I really want to emphasize the intention doesn't say we're going to go and repeal and eliminate tab rates. It's we're going to look at these. And I really want people to focus on that because we recognize that there's some inherent differences with this. There are social obligations that come with these tenures. I don't envision this happening in the next year. That could change, but I am the lead on the policy on this. And I think we're looking at something that would phased in over the next 2 or 3 years.
Okay, thanks for that, Doug. We, of course, have a lot to say about it, but I don't want to dominate the conversation here. We'll be talking about this with our members at our AGM tomorrow morning, and hopefully I'll be able to kind of bring them up to speed a bit more on the engagement opportunities that we have in front of us right now. But one of the important things that my board wanted me to put to you and Sarah was just a commitment on behalf of the ministry to engage with the BCCFA. There are these sort of stakeholder and local government engagement processes that are happening. And we, as we've said before, expect to have a more focused and deep engagement with you and your team once the time comes for that to occur.
Yeah, and I don't have a problem committing to that. The challenge for me is we really have three very targeted groups that we need to clearly engage with, and that's the holders of the First Nation woodland licenses, as well as the Woodlot Association, as well as your association. We're starting really the engagement process in terms of broad engagement which I refer to as intentions paper 18. I don't like to number 18. I don't like to refer to it as tab rates because I think that's a little misleading. But we're having a conversation with that in November. Process will evolve from there. And from Sarah, I've got clear direction that we do need to maintain a close engagement process with the associations on this. The challenge for me is making sure that we have a connection with the First Nation woodland licensees. Okay.
Okay, absolutely. Thanks for that, Doug. Okay, I'm just kind of looking through the chat here. I apologize. I've been scrolling up and down to make sure that I try to capture most of the questions here. Let's see, that. Okay, so we have a question from Jack McDonald about carbon. And he's talking about looking at the carbon potential of BC's forests, and on behalf of people that are actively seeking carbon management projects. And so he's wondering what the province is thinking around supporting carbon projects, I think is the question.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. My understanding right now is, first of all, we can't tenure carbon credits right now under our existing regime under the Forest Act. There are current discussions going on with the Chief Forester's Office as well as Ministry of Environment on what that could look like going forward. So I would say, and I'm not privy to the processes associated with that, but there is a recognition about how would we manage carbon credits going in the future, and what would we need to do to get there. I'd say we're some ways out, but it is clearly recognized that we need to incorporate that. We also get questions about how we would incorporate carbon credits into MPS. And I'm certainly not going to speak to that. I would have to allow my superior on this file with Ellen Bennett having to stand up and speak to that. But it is recognized there are processes in place that are reviewing it. I just can't comment on where they're at. Sorry, Jack.
Okay, thanks for that, Doug. And I know that we have the case of the Cheakamus Community Forest, who has an atmospheric benefit sharing agreement with the province. There may be others that could enter into that type of agreement. What we've learned is that it's pretty onerous, and it takes a lot of upfront investment in order to make that happen. But it's definitely a topic for future conversation, I would say. Okay, I have a question from Steve Lorimer again for you, Doug, that you'd appreciate. Route roads. So can you just elaborate for us a little bit more on government's idea of having more management control over
Sure,
forest
certainly.
roads?
Thanks for the question, by the way, because I think it's the undersold portion of the FRPA bill, that's Bill 23, that's been introduced in the House. What we're looking at is basically being able to provide the administrative tools to support managing forest roads in the long term. So I think it'll really focus on how do we want to use road systems in the future? Are they going to be permanent access routes? Are they going to be temporary? What are the obligations that go with these roads? Right now, we have a model where as long as you maintain the road, there's no obligation or no timelines set with deactivation. So we're changing that around and saying we need to have a discussion at a landscape level and say what's the desire, what's the future desire of the road network. And we're placing provisions in the Act that will enable us to do this. So we have the ability to, as part of the permitting going forward, specify dates by which roads have to be deactivated, or specify dates by which roads have to be constructed, or the time periods in when they can be constructed and deactivated, so that we can do some protections for other resource values, notably ungulates and other environmental priorities. So I'm really happy with what I see coming out of this, because I think it brings us up so that we have the tools to better manage our road network. We're not bringing in a landscape level planning, access management planning model, which we had under the code for a short period of time. But what we are doing is we're enabling, if those conversations start happening at the landscape level, then we've got processes in place to ensure that we can better manage these road networks. This includes the ability to be relieved of road deactivation responsibilities for licensees with various degrees of expectations. I look at that as, not to think of a road as being deactivated by being fully debuilt. I look at it in terms of how do we deal with environmental risks that are associated with roads. So maybe there'll be different categories of deactivation in what we believe is a deactivation now, where you could have a very limited access or no access, all the way up to mom and dad could be driving down the road in a Winnebago. It's a very exciting time for me personally, because I think we're going to look at roads and the imprint they have on there, and the fact that as we continue to build roads, we need to deal with some of the issues that are popping out of the other ones. So we've even enabled the ability to do as part of the planning approval process, and this isn't linked to the landscape level plan. You could do it under the stewardship model right now, where these roads are part of a commitment to deactivate in order to get access and develop in future areas. So it's really quite enabling, but I'll come back to it. I think these are discussions that need to be had at a local level in terms of what are we going to do with this road network, because we can't continue to allow it to expand. It does have one of the most significant impacts on the environment, and we know that. So.
Great. Thanks for that answer, Doug. So I see we're at the end of our session. I apologize if you had a question in the chat that we didn't get to pose to the speakers. I would invite those that really have specific questions about what you heard today, especially related to forest policy, that you want to follow up on, to email me, and I'll do my best to connect with the ministry staff person who can help us get an answer. On behalf of the BCCFA, I want to thank all of the speakers this morning. This was a terrific session. Thank you everyone for tuning in. The BCCFA is making a donation on behalf of the speakers to the Indian, the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. The society is a provincial organization with 20-year history of providing services to Indian residential school survivors, and donations go to enhancing Indigenous-led wellness supports.